All right, so welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going really deep, like way back in time, to explore one of the most iconic works in philosophy. We're diving into Rene Descartes' fifth meditation.
Oh, yeah, Descartes. He's not just some dusty old philosopher. His ideas about certainty and doubt, the nature of reality, these things, they still resonate with us even today.
It's true, it's true. And in the fifth meditation, he's grappling with this question. After all that radical doubt he unleashed earlier, can we be certain about anything at all?
Yeah, it's like he tore down the whole house of knowledge and now he's trying to rebuild it brick by brick,
Yeah.
starting with the most basic foundations.
Exactly, exactly. And one of the most interesting things he does in this meditation is that he brings up this example of a triangle.
The triangle, right?
What do you think makes the triangle such a compelling example for him?
Well, the triangle, you see, it embodies what Descartes calls an immutable nature.
Immutable nature.
What he means by that is that its properties, things like its angles always adding up to 180 degrees, they're just inherently true, no matter what.
So even if I'm dreaming about a triangle?
Even then, or let's say, like a mischievous demon, right, is tricking you into thinking that you're seeing one.
Ah, the demon, yes. Classic Descartes.
Exactly. Even then, those core properties of a triangle, those remain constant. They don't depend on our perception, you see, or even on whether we exist at all.
Hmm, fascinating. So does that mean that we have, like, this innate knowledge of a triangle?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Descartes goes on to suggest that we are born with certain ideas already in place. Like these are not things we learn from experience, but ideas that are part of the structure of our minds themselves, like that triangle, right?
So it's not just that we observe triangles in the world and then form an idea of them.
Nope. Descartes would say the idea is already there, pre-programmed in a way. He calls these innate ideas.
Innate ideas. Okay, now, if some of our ideas are like this, already built into our thinking, where does that leave all the stuff we learn from experience?
That's the question, right? Descartes really throws a wrench into those traditional views about knowledge coming only from our senses.
He really does. So he's got this concept of innate ideas. And it's not just shapes like triangles, right? He goes on to apply this to a much bigger concept, the idea of God.
Ah, yes, the big one. Descartes argues that the idea of God as this supremely perfect being, it's also an innate idea. And this is where things take a really fascinating turn.
Yeah, lay it on me. Where's he going with this?
Well, buckle up. He basically says that if God is perfect, and that's the definition we're working with here, then existence itself must be one of God's perfections.
Wait, so he's saying you can't have a perfect being that doesn't exist? But couldn't I imagine, like, the perfect vacation spot, and it doesn't mean it actually exists?
That's a good question. And Descartes addresses this, believe it or not. He distinguishes between just imagining something, picturing it, and really conceiving of it, understanding its essence. We can imagine a horse with wings, sure, but we can't really conceive of a triangle whose angles don't add up to 180 degrees, or a God that doesn't exist.
So for Descartes, the idea of God, it just has this different kind of necessity to it.
Exactly. It's not just some random invention we came up with. It's built into the very concept of God.
All right, this is all getting pretty complex.
Yeah.
So the very idea of God implies God's existence because existence is, well, a necessary part of perfection. But where did this idea come from? And how does it help us escape all those doubts that Descartes raised earlier?
Oh man, those are the million-dollar questions, aren't they? And that's where we'll have to pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
So last time we were talking about this idea that for Descartes, the idea of God is kind of like a blueprint for perfection. And one of the qualities of that perfect being is that it has to exist. But where did that leave us? How does that get us out of the whole skeptical mess he started with?
Right, right. Well, for Descartes, it all boils down to this. He believes that the very idea of God, this supremely perfect being, it couldn't have come from us. It's just too grand, too perfect.
So it had to be implanted in us by God.
Exactly, which means God has to exist in order to have put that idea in our minds in the first place. And because God is perfect, well, a perfect being wouldn't deceive us, right?
Yeah.
So we can trust those ideas that we perceive, as he puts it, clearly and distinctly.
Okay, so God's like this cosmic guarantor of truth. But how do we know which of our ideas are those clear and distinct ones? Some of my ideas, well, they feel pretty jumbled to me sometimes.
Yeah, that's the tricky part, right? How do we distinguish those really solid, trustworthy ideas from the ones that might just be, I don't know, products of our imagination, or maybe even, some kind of trickery.
Right, like that mischievous demon we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. For Descartes, those clear and distinct perceptions, they have this kind of self-evident quality. They're not just opinions, right, or fleeting thoughts. They kind of hit you with this force of, yeah, this is undeniably true.
It's like when you're working on a puzzle and suddenly it all clicks into place. You just know you've got it right.
That's it, that aha moment. Of course, we should always be critical, right? Question our assumptions, all that. But Descartes believed that these moments of clear and distinct perception, they give us a glimpse of a deeper reality. We can get there through reasoning, through careful thought.
But what about the material world? The stuff we experience with our senses. If I see a tree, how can I be sure it's really there? I mean, Descartes started out doubting the reliability of our senses, remember?
Mm.
So how does he get back to trusting that we're seeing what we think we're seeing?
That's where the idea of God as the ultimate truth teller really comes into play. If God is perfect and wouldn't try to fool us, then our clear and distinct perceptions of the material world, like seeing that tree, well, those have got to be reliable too.
So God bridges the gap, in a way, between our minds and the world outside of us. It's really interesting to think about how Descartes was wrestling with these questions centuries ago, but they still feel relevant today. I mean, we're bombarded with information all the time. How do we know what's real, what's true?
Absolutely. Descartes' whole method, his emphasis on doubting everything, it feels strangely relevant to our world, you know? It's almost like a guidebook for navigating the information overload.
So what do you think? How can we apply his ideas today? I mean, we can't be certain about everything, right? How
Yeah.
do we figure out what to believe?
That's the big challenge, isn't it? I think even if we don't agree with every single one of Descartes' conclusions, his focus on clear and distinct perception, that's huge. And his method of radical doubt, that's powerful stuff.
So maybe it's not about finding absolute certainty, but more about learning to think critically, questioning things, instead of just blindly accepting whatever we come across.
Right, that's it. It's about cultivating that inner sense of, hold on, does this really make sense? And that's something we'll explore more as we wrap up our deep dive.
Okay, so we've spent all this time digging into Descartes' ideas about doubt, certainty, God, all that good stuff. But let's bring it back down to earth for a second. How does any of this actually apply to us, like in our everyday lives?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? I mean, we can't all just lock ourselves away in a room with a fireplace and ponder the mysteries in the universe like Descartes did.
Right, exactly. So how do we take these big philosophical concepts and, actually use them, especially in a world where it's like we're constantly bombarded with information, opinions, you name it.
It can be overwhelming for sure, but Descartes gives us some good tools to deal with all that. Like he was really big on this idea of clear and distinct perception.
Right. Yeah, we were talking about that earlier. So what's that got to do with like navigating the information overload?
Well, it's about really looking at what we believe. Like not just going along with things because, everyone else does or because it feels good. It's about grounding our beliefs in something solid.
So asking ourselves, okay, do I actually understand this? Does it make sense? And like, is there any real evidence to back it up?
Yeah, exactly. It's about developing this inner sense of like, hold on a second, is this legit? Learning to trust our own judgment, you know?
Earlier, we were talking about innate ideas, those concepts that Descartes thought were like built into our minds from birth. He uses the triangle example, right? But then he takes it even further and says, hey, even the idea of God is innate.
Yeah.
This whole innate knowledge thing, it's so interesting, but I don't know, it's also kind of a head scratcher. Do you think there are really any ideas that we're born with? Or does it all come from experience?
Ooh, good question. That's one of those debates that philosophers have been going back and forth on forever. But it's worth thinking about, right? Are there certain concepts that are just so fundamental to how we think that it's hard to imagine how we could have picked them up just from experience alone? Like, think about logic or the idea that everything has a cause. They seem like pretty basic building blocks for understanding the world, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder if there's like a structure already there in our minds
Yeah.
shaping how we see everything. Descartes, of course, he was sure that we have at least one innate idea, the idea of God.
Oh.
But even if we're not, on board with all of his religious ideas, I think the possibility of innate knowledge, it kind of opens up these fascinating questions.
Absolutely. And even if we don't agree with every single one of his conclusions, the way Descartes approached things, that whole method of radical doubt, questioning everything, that's something we can all learn from.
So it's about more than just the specific answers he came up with. It's about that whole process of thinking critically.
Right. It's about cultivating curiosity, being
Mm.
willing to challenge our own assumptions, and always being open to, learning and growing. That's how we get closer to the truth, whatever that might be.
It feels like, we've just scratched the surface of Descartes' ideas here. But hopefully it sparked some new thoughts, some new questions, and maybe even a little bit of that, aha, I get it now feeling.
That's what it's all about. Keep asking those questions. Keep exploring. Who knows what you might discover?
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. We encourage you to keep digging into Descartes, see where your own journey takes you. Until next time, keep those minds sharp and keep those questions coming.